The early 1980s were a wild time to be a crime reporter in South Florida. Raymond Blake knew that all too well. A transplant from Charleston, South Carolina, Raymond had landed a job with the Palm Grove Ledger, a small but scrappy local newspaper with a growing readership thanks to the explosion of drug-related violence trickling out of Miami. He wasn't covering stories from an ivory tower. Either he was in the field chasing leads in neighborhoods most reporters wouldn't drive through after dark. It was dangerous, gritty work, but for a young man who believed in the power of the press, it was worth every drop of sweat, and the paycheck didn't hurt either. What started as a modest assignment quickly turned into something much larger, something that would haunt him for decades. Raymond wasn't the kind of guy who spooked easily. He'd seen crime scenes that would make a hardened cop lose his lunch, and he had a keen instinct for truth hidden beneath layers of red tape and public relations spin. But there was one story, just one, that always stuck with him. It began on Halloween night in 1981 in an affluent boating community in Palm Grove, Florida. What should have been a carefree teenage costume party turned into a missing persons case that shocked the entire region. A high school junior named Heather Millstone vanished without a trace. The initial theory was tragically simple. She got drunk, wandered off, and drowned in one of the nearby canals. But no body was ever found. And 3 days later, when she stumbled out of the woods off a stretch of South Dixie Highway, battered, half-dressed, and traumatized, Raymond realized this wasn't just a tragic accident. It was the beginning of a mystery far darker and more tangled than anyone imagined. It wasn't just another story. For Raymond, it became the only story that mattered. Raymond Blake had covered enough crime scenes to know that evil rarely announced itself. It crept in quietly under the cover of normalcy. And that's exactly how it began on October 31st, 1981, in the upscale neighborhood of Coral Cove, just off the Palm Grove Canal system. That night, Douglas Carrington, a wealthy boat dealership owner known for his philanthropic flair, allowed his 17-year-old daughter Amber to host a Halloween costume party in their backyard. It was meant to be a social highlight for the local teens, complete with music, snacks, string lights, and a rented fog machine that made the place look like a horror movie set. Kids from all over Palm Grove High showed up in droves: pirates, vampires, cheerleaders, and werewolves roaming the Carrington lawn without a care in the world. Among them was Heather Millstone, Amber's close friend, and a standout student with a quiet personality. Heather wasn't the wild type. She was bookish, polite, and always home before curfew. But that night she let her guard down. Some of the teens had smuggled in beer and cheap vodka. Nothing unusual for a suburban Halloween party, but something went wrong. Somewhere between midnight and 12:30 a.m., as parents began arriving and Mr. Carrington politely told guests it was time to head home, Heather simply disappeared. At first, nobody noticed. Teenagers were laughing, hugging, piling into cars, and heading off to after-parties or home. But by the next morning, Heather's parents were calling the Palm Grove Police Department, panicked that she never returned home. The local theory was tragically plausible. Heather had gotten tipsy, wandered off into one of the canals behind the houses, and drowned. The canal systems were man-made, winding through the neighborhood like liquid alleyways, offering every backyard a boat dock, and unfortunately, an easy route for accidents. Law enforcement began dragging the canal within hours. The media coverage was intense, and Raymond had his notebook ready. He sensed something deeper, something wrong. There were no signs of splashing, no screams, no witnesses. Just silence. And then came the twist that would set everything in motion 3 days later. A truck driver spotted a teenage girl stumbling out of a wooded patch along South Dixie Highway, barely clothed, dazed, and mumbling her name, Heather Millstone. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't safe either. What happened to her during those missing days would crack open a mystery that, in Raymond's words, started like a party and ended like a cover-up. The girl who stumbled out of the woods off South Dixie Highway barely resembled the Heather Millstone that friends and neighbors remembered. The truck driver who found her, a man named Carl Henley, told reporters he nearly mistook her for a Halloween prank. Her disheveled appearance, ripped clothing, and glazed expression seemed too unreal to be anything but staged. But as he wrapped his jacket around her trembling shoulders and asked her name, she gave him a single raspy answer: Heather. That was all he needed to hear. By the time paramedics arrived, Heather had collapsed from exhaustion, and the real horror of her disappearance was just beginning to surface. At Palm Grove General Hospital, doctors confirmed what many feared but hoped against. Heather had been drugged, likely sedated with something powerful, and she had suffered repeated sexual assaults over the course of at least 48 hours. She had no memory of how she was abducted. Only fleeting impressions: darkness, a scratchy blindfold, the cold floor beneath her, and the sickly sweet scent of cinnamon lingering in the air. For the next few days, she remained in a sedated, monitored state, while her parents sat beside her, helpless, devastated. Raymond Blake managed to speak briefly with her father, who said the family was grateful she was alive, but afraid she might never come back fully. The emotional aftermath was swift and crushing. Heather withdrew from school. She stopped seeing friends. Her name was whispered in school hallways and coffee shops, sometimes with pity, sometimes with that cruel curiosity small towns can't resist. There was talk that she might move away, or that the Millstones were considering sending her to live with an aunt in Tampa. Raymond, ever the observer, noticed that no official statement had been made by police beyond an ongoing investigation. Despite the gravity of what had happened, there were no arrests, no persons of interest, just speculation and silence. Behind the scenes, law enforcement faced a problem. Heather remembered very little with clarity. The trauma had fragmented her mind, and while she cooperated as best she could, there was little that could stand as hard evidence. But even in her confusion, she was certain of one detail. Every time she woke in the place she was held, one of her attackers had breath that smelled strongly of cinnamon. At the time, it seemed almost too specific to matter. But Raymond wrote it down anyway, underlining it twice in his notes. That smell, that flavor. It would come back to him months later like a ghost. For now, though, he was watching a small Florida town pretend to move on. Halloween decorations were packed away. The Carringtons' perfect lawn looked pristine once again. But under the surface, people were scared because the man who'd done this to Heather Millstone hadn't vanished into the night. He was still out there, possibly living next door, possibly attending church, possibly smiling to your face at the grocery store, and no one, not the police, not the press, not even Heather, could say who he was. With Heather Millstone alive but shattered, Palm Grove demanded answers. The town buzzed with theories, and law enforcement found itself under a floodlight of public scrutiny. The easiest path forward: find a suspect who made sense. And they found one. His name was Frank Juneau. Frank was a known name in the area, though not in the polite dinner party sort of way. He lived like a ghost on the edge of society, squatting in a half-finished house on Baywater Point. A development project stalled after the recession. He had no job, no family, and no business being in one of the wealthiest corners of South Florida. He got around using a small skiff he'd acquired using the canal system, like a thief's freeway, slipping into yards, stealing garden tools, alcohol, even patio furniture, anything that could be pawned or flipped. Police had arrested him half a dozen times for trespassing, loitering, and petty theft, but his record had one glaring mark that made everyone stop and listen. Back in 1961, Frank Juneau had been arrested for abducting a 14-year-old girl, his neighbor. He'd bundled her into his car while she walked home from school, and if not for a quick-thinking witness who took down his plate, she might have disappeared forever. Juneau did 16 years in prison for aggravated kidnapping and had kept a low profile ever since. That was until Heather vanished. It was Douglas Carrington Amber's father and host of the Halloween party who pointed the police toward Juneau. Carrington claimed Juno had been spotted near his home more than once and had even frightened his 16-year-old daughter during a sunbathing incident. That accusation, combined with Juno's rap sheet, was all law enforcement needed to zero in. His alibis were weak. Witnesses were shaky. He had no lawyer, no family, and no resources to defend himself. He was in every way a convenient suspect. But convenience and truth don't always live in the same neighborhood. Raymond Blake followed the case closely. As a reporter, he'd covered dozens of police operations, and something about this one didn't sit right. It all felt too fast, too smooth. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief when Juno was named a person of interest, but Raymond knew that kind of relief often came with a blindfold. According to internal sources, Juno was questioned multiple times, and while his timeline was messy, it wasn't damning. One neighbor recalled seeing him stumbling drunk past their house at the approximate time Heather went missing. Another claimed he'd seen Juno at a dive bar near Cape Florida Beach later that night. Still, the police didn't budge. Juno was their guy. Until he wasn't. In March of 1982, a boating goods store on Marina Row was broken into, and a witness described a man resembling Juno. When officers arrived at his squat, they expected a routine arrest. What they got was a gunfight. Juno opened fire with a stolen .45. Police returned with overwhelming force. By the time the dust settled, Frank Juno was dead. To most in Palm Grove, it was closure. The threat was gone. Heather's attacker had been punished, even if not through the courts. But for Raymond Blake, it only raised more questions. Why would a man being watched so closely suddenly snap over a break-in? Why had Carrington, so loud in his push for justice, gone curiously silent after Juno's death? And why did that damn cinnamon detail from Heather's account still refuse to let go of his thoughts? In truth, Juno's death hadn't ended the case. It had buried it. And buried something else with it. The truth. Frank Juno's violent death was in many ways a gift-wrapped conclusion for Palm Grove's frightened citizens. The man with the sordid past, the creepy eyes, and the bad reputation had gone out in a blaze of gunfire, just like the villain in a B-movie. Local headlines used words like closure and justice served. But to Raymond Blake, it felt more like theater, a performance designed to satisfy a community desperate for answers, even if the script had been poorly written. Raymond attended the press conference the following morning. The police chief was smiling, relaxed, almost triumphant. When asked if the case was officially closed, he skirted the question, but made it clear they had no further leads. Raymond noticed that Douglas Carrington, once the most vocal advocate for justice, was conspicuously absent. No statement, no billboard, no reward reminder, just silence. And that silence echoed louder than any siren. The cinnamon detail still haunted Raymond. It wasn't something Frank Juno was known for. He was more rum and cigarettes than sugar and spice. And there was something else, the original alibi. That blurry bar footage from Cape Florida Beach. It had never been returned to the bar owner. It had simply disappeared. The officer Raymond contacted about it gave a sheepish excuse about legal limitations, citing a high-priced attorney's advice. That attorney, Raymond would later learn, had been recommended by Carrington himself. It was a connection too sharp to ignore. While the town moved on, Raymond found himself stuck rooted in the same spot, haunted by the feeling that they hadn't caught Heather's real attacker. They'd just buried the wrong man, and with him, buried the truth. The more he pulled at the thread, the more the clean narrative started to unravel. Raymond Blake couldn't let it go. While the rest of Palm Grove moved on, returning to Sunday barbecues, sailboat races, and softball fundraisers, he kept circling the same questions. If Frank Juno was truly Heather's abductor, why did so many pieces refuse to fit? That cinnamon detail stuck out like a splinter beneath the skin. Heather had been sure. Every time the man who violated her leaned in close, his breath carried the unmistakable scent of sweet cinnamon. It wasn't a room fragrance or a general ambiance. It was him. And Frank Juno, by all accounts, was a sour man, the kind who reeked of body odor, stale beer, and backwoods Florida humidity. So, Raymond started retracing steps the police had long since abandoned. He returned to Buddy's Tavern, the dingy bar near Cape Florida Beach that Juno was rumored to have visited the night Heather disappeared. The place hadn't changed, same flickering neon, same warped bar stools. The owner, Saul Myers, was still behind the counter and still bitter about the way the cops handled his security footage. They took the copy and never brought it back. Saul grumbled, sliding a glass of ice water across the bar. Said it was too blurry to use, then forgot it existed. But what the police hadn't known or hadn't cared to ask was that Saul still had the original VHS tape stored in a dusty drawer beneath the cash register. And when he popped it into the old TV behind the bar, Raymond leaned in, his heart hammering. The footage wasn't crisp. This was 1981, not HD, but it was clear enough. A tall, lanky man with bleached hair and an unmistakable gait sauntered through the frame around 12:42 a.m., wearing swim trunks, sandals, and a white tank top. He had a drink in one hand, a cigarette in the other. Even without a full facial shot, Raymond knew what he was looking at. The man's fashion choices, posture, and general air of dishevelment all screamed one name: Frank Juno. So why had this never made it into the case file? Raymond tracked down the officer who'd handled the footage, Detective Alvers, now semi-retired and running a small security business on the side. When pressed, Alvers admitted the footage had indeed been strongly suggestive of Juno's alibi, but had been dismissed on the advice of a defense attorney hired to protect the integrity of the investigation. When Raymond asked who recommended the attorney, Alvers didn't hesitate. Carrington, he said flatly. Said he knew a guy who could keep the case airtight. Didn't want any room for doubt. That name again. Douglas Carrington. The man who had offered a $10,000 reward demanded justice on local TV and even erected a billboard asking the public for leads. But the more Raymond dug, the more Carrington's image began to crack. He wasn't just a grieving father figure trying to help. He was shaping the narrative, pointing fingers, and intentionally or not, burying the truth. Back at the Palm Grove Ledger, Raymond took the tape to his editor, laid out everything: Heather's cinnamon clue, Juno's real alibi, the attorney link, and Carrington's increasing evasiveness. His editor listened, nodded slowly, then exhaled. If we run this, we better have legal triple-check every word. Carrington's ad money pays a third of our staff. That was the moment Raymond understood what he was really up against. Not just a cover-up, a system. One that had every reason to keep Carrington clean and the story tidy. A scapegoat had died in a hail of bullets, and the man with the cinnamon breath was still out there. Maybe even waving to neighbors. Maybe even coming home to the Carrington estate. Raymond had once believed in tidy resolutions. But this case? This one was different. This one was layered in money, fear, and a silence so deep it roared in his ears. He hadn't solved the case. He'd stepped into something far darker, the kind of truth polite towns like Palm Grove pretend doesn't exist. With the bar footage now burned into his mind and Carrington's fingerprints smeared across every angle of the investigation, Raymond Blake knew he couldn't move forward without returning to the source, Heather Millstone. He had avoided speaking with her directly before, both out of respect and caution. The last thing he wanted was to re-traumatize a young woman barely piecing her life back together. But now, with new information in hand and the shadow of a cover-up taking shape, he felt he owed her the truth, and maybe she had more of it to offer in return. Heather's father, Patrick Millstone, answered the door with a wary expression. His wife stood behind him, arms folded, protective but calm. After a long, quiet exchange at the doorstep, they invited Raymond in. Heather sat on the couch, thin and pale but alert. Her eyes, once lost behind sedation and trauma, now carried a flicker of recognition and guarded strength. Raymond approached gently, notepad closed, voice steady. He asked about the cinnamon. Heather nodded almost immediately. He always smelled like it. she said, her voice just above a whisper. Every time. She explained it wasn't just a passing scent. It was on his breath, close, invasive. She believed it came from candy, not cologne or room spray. Atomic fireballs, maybe. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she knew. "And you told the police this?" Raymond asked. "Over and over," she replied. "I told every detective they sent. Nobody ever wrote it down." Raymond's pen didn't move. He didn't need to write it. The confirmation echoed with the weight of something final. Not just a forgotten detail, but a discarded truth. A clue that had been inconvenient because it didn't fit the narrative the town had already accepted. Before leaving, Raymond thanked Heather and her parents for their time. Patrick Millstone clasped his hand with the grip of a father who'd lost everything but refused to break. As Raymond walked to his car, he didn't feel triumphant, just hollow. The system had failed Heather. Worse, it had chosen to. The scent of cinnamon, once innocent and nostalgic, had become a signature of guilt, one the town had chosen to ignore. It had taken Raymond Blake nearly 8 months of investigating to realize something strange, something no one else had ever brought up, not the police, not reporters, not even the townspeople who gossiped over morning coffee. Douglas Carrington had a son. His name was Eli Carrington, and until that point, he might as well have been a ghost. Raymond stumbled across the detail by accident, buried in an old community newsletter from 1979 that listed Carrington's donation to a school for children with learning disabilities. The donation had been made in honor of his son Eli. That one mention sparked a cascade of questions. Why wasn't Eli mentioned in any police interviews? Why hadn't his name come up during the initial investigation, especially when the crime happened in his own home during a party hosted by his sister Digging? Deeper, Raymond spoke with a few students who had been at the Halloween party that night. Most had no idea the Carringtons even had a son, but 2 of them girls, who had stepped out for air during the peak of the party, vaguely remembered seeing an older teen near the back porch. He wasn't in costume, didn't mingle, and didn't speak. One of the girls remembered thinking he looked off. She assumed he was a security guard. That was the turning point. Raymond returned to his notes and matched this vague figure with a separate thread. One of the hired guards mentioned that a young man not part of the guest list had briefly spoken with him during the party, then disappeared into the house. When pressed at the time, the guard had said it was probably family. The cops never followed up. Why? Because Douglas Carrington told them his son was upstairs the whole night. No questions asked. When Raymond finally called Carrington's estate to request an interview with Eli, the phone was answered by an assistant who claimed Eli didn't speak to strangers. That was the last time anyone picked up his calls. The second time he called the line was dead within 3 seconds. No explanation, no curiosity, just a firm, practiced silence. It was becoming clear to Raymond that Eli Carrington was not just overlooked, he had been deliberately removed from the story. And then came the next revelation. Eli was known for his obsession with horror movies. A former caretaker who once worked for the Carringtons described Eli as socially frozen in time, someone who preferred to live in a dark, windowless room on the 3rd floor of the estate, often wearing the same clothes for days and watching slasher films on loop. He rarely spoke in full sentences, didn't go to school after age 16, and had no friends. But he had a sweet tooth, a big one. The former caretaker remembered one thing. Vividly, Eli ate atomic fireballs constantly. His room was full of empty wrappers. Raymond didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The pieces had started to align. The scent, the silence, the sun. And for the first time since Heather stumbled out of those woods, Raymond felt less like a reporter and more like the last person in Palm Grove willing to admit what everyone else had decided to forget. Raymond Blake had followed leads before. He'd chased tip-offs through swamps, sat in parked cars for hours, and gone door to door for stories no one wanted told. But nothing could have prepared him for how casually the final puzzle piece would fall into place while waiting in line for groceries at the Palm Grove Cash and Carry. It was November 1st, 1982, just a day after Halloween. Raymond had dropped by the store after work to grab some dinner and clear his head. He was lost in thought when he noticed the woman ahead of him at the register a familiar face. Anessa, one of the Carrington family's longtime housekeepers. He recognized her from the handful of times he'd visited the estate early in his investigation. Back when Carrington was still playing the concerned citizen role, Anessa greeted him kindly, not remembering or pretending not to remember his connection to the Heather Millstone case. As they chatted, Raymond's eyes wandered to the groceries she was placing on the belt standard cleaning supplies, canned goods, and at least 5 large bags of Halloween candy, all atomic fireballs. "Somebody's got a sweet tooth," Raymond joked, gesturing toward the candy. Anessa chuckled. "Oh, those all for Eli. He goes through them like water." Raymond felt a shiver trace the back of his neck. "I didn't know they were cinnamon flavored," he said casually. Anessa glanced at the bag, then at Raymond. "That's what makes them spicy." He managed a weak smile, nodded, and helped her pack a few items. She said goodbye and headed for the parking lot. But for Raymond, time had stopped. Cinnamon. The same scent Heather Millstone said she smelled every time her attacker leaned close. The same scent no one had taken seriously, dismissed by the police, buried in a forgotten report. And now, here it was confirmed by the one person who likely spent more time in the Carrington home than anyone else. Eli didn't just like cinnamon. He consumed it obsessively. It wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was personal. Heather had been right. Raymond stood at the register with a bottle of Hamburger Helper in one hand and a truth so heavy it nearly buckled his knees. The town had pointed fingers at an ex-con while the monster lived behind marble columns and manicured hedges. Worse, that monster had been protected not just by family, but by silence. And now Raymond knew what he had to do. Raymond Blake left the grocery store that night with a pounding heart and the bitter taste of inevitability on his tongue. The pieces had all fallen into place. The cinnamon-scented breath, the secretive sun, the security guard's vague recollections. And now the candy atomic fireballs bought in bulk, casually confirmed by the Carrington housekeeper. It was no longer theory. It was narrative. The kind of narrative that didn't need confession or a courtroom to scream the truth. But screaming it, that was another story altogether. Back at the Palm Grove Ledger, Raymond sat down with his editor, Roger McCarthy, and laid everything out. The timeline, the patterns, the contradictions. He even showed him the original security footage from Buddy's Tavern, now dubbed and preserved. McCarthy listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as Raymond spoke. When it was over, he leaned back and exhaled long and low. "You really think it's Eli?" he asked. Raymond didn't flinch. "I don't think." "I know." McCarthy rubbed his face. "Then write it. Write the damn thing. But don't name him outright. Not unless we want to end up in court for the next 10 years. We'll run it through legal. Frame it as a question, not an accusation." Raymond went home and worked through the night. The article came together with the urgency of a pulse. He built it on facts, but more than that, he built it on the gaps, the gaping holes, where a son should have been questioned, where a clue should have been followed, where a girl's suffering should have mattered. It was a piece not about guilt, but about deliberate silence. He didn't have to say Eli Carrington's name. The outline of the truth was enough to set the town on fire. By the following afternoon, the draft had passed legal review with minor edits. Raymond returned to the newsroom, ready to hit publish. That's when McCarthy called him into his office with a different expression, one Raymond hadn't seen before. Not stress, not concern. Defeat. "Carrington just signed a 2-year advertising deal," McCarthy said, sliding a copy of the contract across the desk. Full-page spreads. Boats, jet skis, $100 grand. Raymond stared at it. The ink was still fresh. McCarthy didn't look up. "It's not going to run?" "You're killing it," Raymond asked, barely able to keep the edge out of his voice. McCarthy sighed. I don't have a choice. This paper's hanging on by threads, Ray. That ad money pays 3 people's salaries, including yours. Raymond stood in silence, the weight of months collapsing in his chest. He bought the story, he whispered. He bought the space, McCarthy corrected, almost as if it mattered. Raymond left the office with a gut full of rage and no outlet. It was all too perfect. Carrington's timing, the volume of the contract, the calculated way he'd wielded his wealth not to tell a story, but to erase one. It wasn't the first time Raymond had encountered suppression, but it was the first time it felt so precise, so engineered. Later that week, a new edition of the Ledger went to print. The center spread featured a smiling Carrington next to a brand new line of luxury watercraft. Above it, in bold red font, "Adventure awaits. Summer starts here." And in Raymond's desk drawer, the article sat unpublished, just ink and heartbreak on a forgotten page. He thought of Heather, of her shaking voice describing cinnamon breath, of the days she'd lost and the years she might never get back, of her father's quiet, desperate grip on his hand. He had promised himself he'd help them find justice. Instead, he had run headfirst into the wall that divides truth from power. Raymond knew better than most that journalism was never meant to be easy. But this time it wasn't about being tough. It was about surviving in a world where stories didn't just get buried. They were erased, paved over with ads and cocktail parties, silenced by men who knew exactly how much the truth cost. And in Palm Grove, that price had already been paid. In the months that followed, Raymond Blake watched the story fade. Like the scent of cinnamon in a room long abandoned, it lingered only in the minds of those who knew where to look, but no one wanted to look. The town of Palm Grove returned to its sunshine-slicked normal. The Carringtons remained fixtures in local society, appearing at charity galas and yacht unveilings with practiced smiles. Heather Millstone, after a brief attempt to return to school, quietly left town. Rumors said she moved in with relatives out in Gainesville. Her parents followed a few months later, their porch light forever off. And Raymond. He stayed. Not because he believed he could change anything, but because some part of him needed to bear witness to remember what others so eagerly forgot. He kept his notes, the VHS tape, the scribbled drafts, even the grocery receipt from that night at Cash and Carry. They were locked in a drawer in his apartment, labeled only with a date, October 31st, 1981. Sometimes he thought about turning the story into a book. But the thought always ended the same way, if the town didn't want the truth. When it was fresh and bleeding, why would they care once it was wrapped in paper and bound for shelves? Raymond never confronted Carrington again. There was no point. Men like him didn't need to lie. They just waited for everyone else to give up. And still Raymond hadn't. Not really. He found himself jotting down a single sentence one sleepless night, long after the paper had changed hands and his role had shifted to feature columns and obituaries. The sentence read, "The man who hurt Heather Millstone didn't disappear. He was hidden in plain sight behind the wealth of someone who couldn't afford for the truth to matter." He didn't publish it, but he left it on his desk. Not for the public, not for Carrington, but for himself. A reminder that some stories were never meant to be told out loud, not because they weren't true, but because the world wasn't ready to hear them. And yet, the weight of silence never fully lifted. Not from his shoulders, not from Palm Grove. To this day, Raymond walks past the Carrington estate every so often now, gated and newly landscaped, the house a little quieter, the windows a little darker. And each time he wonders, does Eli still live there? Does he remember what he did? Or worse, does he even understand? The cinnamon trail is long cold now, but Raymond still smells it every October. Some stories never make the front page, not because they lack truth, but because the truth threatens to unravel too much. In Palm Grove, the leaves still turn. Each fall kids still dress up on Halloween and no one speaks of Heather Millstone. But Raymond Blake remembers. He remembers the silence. He remembers the candy. And he remembers that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding in the dark. They're the ones everyone's too afraid to name. My name's Caleb Winslow. I'm 39 years old, live alone in a 2-bedroom ranch-style house on the outskirts of Keene, New Hampshire, and if there's one thing I truly despise, it's Halloween. I know that sounds harsh, but hear me out. I'm not talking about the innocent kind, where little kids dress up like pumpkins or princesses and toddle around with their parents. No, I'm talking about the over-commercialized, lawless free-for-all it's turned into. To me, October 31st isn't a celebration of creativity or community. It's a noisy, chaotic, sugar-soaked parade of entitlement, a day when people forget basic manners and boundaries because some giant candy corporation said it's tradition. It's capitalism in a mask. Every year, I try to endure it. I don't put up decorations. I don't buy candy. I don't carve pumpkins or hang faux cobwebs on my porch like my neighbors do. What I do is put up a very clear laminated sign by my front walk that reads, in bold black letters, "No trick-or-treaters, no exceptions." I don't think it's too much to ask to be left alone in my own home, especially on a night that turns normally quiet neighborhoods into shrieking zoos. For a couple of years, that sign worked. Kids skipped my house, and I spent my Halloween evenings in peace playing video games or reading in the dark with blackout curtains drawn. But last October was different. That was the year a group of bratty kids decided they were above rules, above respect. And that was the year I realized just how thin the line is between being left alone and being provoked. What happened after that? Well, let's just say no one rang my doorbell this year. For 2 straight years, that sign was my shield. It stood like a lone soldier on the edge of my walkway, firm and unapologetic. No trick-or-treaters. No exceptions. All caps, laminated, zip-tied to a metal stake I hammered 6 inches into the soil. It wasn't there to be cute. It wasn't up for interpretation. And in 2021 and 2022, to my surprise, it worked. Not a single knock. Not one doorbell ring. The little ghouls and goblins just passed me by, like my house didn't exist. And that was exactly how I liked it. I thought maybe, just maybe, the neighborhood was learning. Or maybe I had finally earned my peace through sheer consistency and sheer will. I would spend those Halloween nights inside with all the lights off, sipping hot chamomile and queuing up horror movies from the 70s, the kind with real atmosphere, not jump scares and CGI garbage. Sometimes I'd even hear the kids outside their squeaky voices carrying over the hedges as they compared candy hauls and fought over who got the last Reese's. But they never came near. That sign worked like garlic to a vampire, but peace is fragile, like glass. And all it takes is one kid with a brat streak and a little too much confidence to throw a rock straight through it. Last year, that's exactly what happened. Only it wasn't a rock. It was something much worse. It started just after sunset. I remember because I'd just settled into my recliner with a mug of peppermint tea and my second rewatch of The Thing. That eerie opening score was playing when I heard it a knock. Not the mailman, not Amazon. It was Halloween night, and someone had the nerve to knock. At first, I convinced myself it had to be a mistake. A neighbor, maybe. But as I opened the door there, they were 4 kids, standing on my front step, each wearing one of those mass-produced, plastic-smelling Marvel hero costumes you can find at any Walmart for $20. Leading the pack was a boy in a cheap Iron Man getup, maybe 12 or 13. The others were Captain America Hulk and a slouched Spider-Man. They stood in a crooked line, shouted a half-hearted trick-or-treat in unison, and stared at me like I owed them something. Like my house was just one more candy dispenser on their map. I felt heat rise behind my eyes. I looked at the Iron Man kid and said flatly, "Your costume's not even lore accurate." He blinked. What? So I told him. explained how the arc reactor in the comics was traditionally yellow, not the blue nonsense from the MCU, and how it was a marketing ploy tied to the Black Panther franchise. I was halfway through the sentence when I realized none of them were listening. They just stood there puzzled, maybe a little freaked out. So I stepped back inside and slammed the door. It should have ended there. That should have been enough to send them on their way. But something about the way they looked at me confused, almost amused, lit a fuse I didn't even know I had. And what happened next made that knock feel like the opening shot of a war. I hadn't even made it back to my chair when the second knock came, this time louder, more deliberate. It was like they knew I'd be fuming and they wanted to add fuel to the fire. My heart was still hammering from the first encounter, and my fingers were already trembling as I marched back to the front door. I threw it open with all the subtlety of a battering ram, expecting maybe a neighbor trying to apologize for their kid's bad manners. Nope. Same 4 kids, standing in the exact same spot, like they'd hit pause and rewind. The Iron Man kid, Tyson. I'd later learn his name, tilted his helmet up, a smug grin on his face. "You know we gotta trick you now, right?" he said. His voice was light sing-songy, the kind of teasing that middle schoolers think is harmless. But to me, it felt like a slap in the face. The others snickered, nudging each other as if this was the funniest thing they'd done all night. And maybe to them it was. Maybe they thought it was hilarious to mock a guy just trying to be left alone. But in that moment, something in me snapped. I didn't yell, I roared. I warned them that if they came near my house again, I'd be contacting every parent in the neighborhood, the school, whoever I had to. I told them I had cameras and wasn't afraid to use them, even if I didn't actually have any. Then I slammed the door again, hard enough that one of the panes rattled in the frame. It should have ended there. But as I stood in my hallway chest, heaving palms slick with sweat, I realized something terrifying. They weren't scared. They were entertained. And that made them dangerous in a way no horror movie monster ever could be. These kids weren't just ignoring boundaries, they were daring me to react. And I had. I played right into it. But the next time, I promised myself I'd be ready. I figured that would be the end of it. One well-timed outburst, a slammed door, and maybe a call to a parent the next day if I could match a face to an address. I even managed to sit back down at my desk and fire up Overwatch, hoping a few matches would smooth my nerves. But barely 10 minutes passed before another knock echoed through the house. This one softer, almost hesitant. It made my blood run cold. 3 times in one night. That wasn't persistence. That was escalation. I stormed to the door, yanked it open, and came face to face, not with the Marvel brats, but a woman in a fleece jacket, flanked by 2 much younger kids in animal onesies. Her brow furrowed as I demanded whether they were blind. Couldn't they see the sign? She looked confused. "What sign?" she asked. My stomach dropped. I stepped around her and scanned the yard. The walkway, the patch of grass where the sign had been planted just hours earlier. Nothing. Not even the zip tie. Just a patch of disturbed soil and a mocking emptiness. My laminated all-caps warning had been stolen, ripped up, taken who knows. And there was no doubt in my mind who did it. I didn't yell at the woman after that. I just told her tightly to get off my property. Then I went back inside, shut the door, and leaned against it, heart pounding like a drum. It was more than just a prank now. They had crossed a line. That sign was my boundary, my defense. And they'd taken it from me. The house didn't feel safe anymore. Neither did I. And when I sat down trembling and short of breath, I knew I wasn't just angry, I was afraid. I didn't leave the house after that. I couldn't. My skin felt too thin, like the world was pressing in from all sides. I took a fast-acting anxiety pill, taped a new sign to the inside of my front window, bigger, bolder, underlined in red marker, and tried to breathe through the haze. I kept telling myself it was over. They got their laugh. The sign was gone. They'd move on, but peace doesn't return just because you ask nicely. I was midway through a second attempt at distracting myself, this time playing a mindless puzzle game when I heard it. Thunk! Then thunk thunk. A short pause. Splat! The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. Egg. I ripped off my headphones and rushed to the front window. 3 broken eggs were sliding down the glass yoke, streaking over my fresh sign like yellow tears. One shell stuck cracked and defiant right over the word no. I didn't even feel angry at first, just hollow, like something had slipped loose in my chest. The next thing I remember clearly, I was in the bathroom curled into the tub, right hand bloodied and throbbing. I'd punched something wall cabinet, maybe the refrigerator. I couldn't remember. I took another pill, ran cold water over my knuckles, and sat beneath the spray for a long time staring at the grout. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just let it all wash over me. Later, I dried off, wrapped my hand, and collapsed onto the couch. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. That wasn't the end of their game. And as much as I tried to deny it, some dark part of me had already decided I was going to play. It was around 9:00 p.m. when I finally stirred from the couch. My hands still throbbed, wrapped tight in gauze, but the edge of the panic had dulled. I figured I'd make myself a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Comfort food's something simple. I didn't bother turning on the kitchen lights. I like low light after a panic spiral. It helps me stay grounded. The house was still just the way I like it. For a moment, it almost felt like the worst had passed. Then I heard it. Thunk! A soft, subtle shift in weight on stone. It came from the side of the house, specifically the narrow strip of walkway near the wooden gate that leads to the backyard. I froze. That spot has a loose paving stone, has for years. When someone steps on it even lightly, it knocks just enough to be noticeable. No one would know that unless they'd walked it before, unless they'd planned to. I didn't need to look to know it was one of them. I moved upstairs quietly, half thinking I'd just ride it out in the bedroom, wait for them to get bored and leave. But as I reached the top of the staircase, I caught movement through the frosted edge of the front door glass. A silhouette. Kids. Same height, same build. My blood turned to ice. This wasn't just mischief anymore. It wasn't about candy or costumes or tricks. They were circling my house, testing me, pushing, daring me to react. And I did. I slipped on my sneakers, crept down to the back door, and waited. Hand on the knob, breath held. No more warnings, no more signs. This time, they'd learn what it meant to ignore the one house on the street that didn't play games. I counted to 5 before yanking the door open and charging outside like something uncoiled. The cold slapped me in the face, but I barely felt it. My eyes locked on the shadow darting near the fence Iron Man. Tyson. Caught mid-step, sneakers skidding in the grass. The look on his face when he saw me barreling toward him, pure, undiluted fear. It was better than any horror movie payoff I'd ever seen. He turned to run, but he'd misjudged how fast a grown man with 243 pounds of fury could move. I collided with him like a battering ram, shoulder first, and sent him crashing into the wooden slats lining my backyard. The fence groaned, but didn't break. He crumpled to the ground with a dull thud, trying to scramble away on all fours. I didn't let him. Some primal part of me took over. I grabbed him hard by the shoulders and flipped him. He tried to scream, but my hand clamped over his mouth before he could. I could feel the panic in his breath, the way his chest stuttered beneath my grip, and then I squeezed. Not enough to kill him. I knew exactly where to apply pressure to cut off airflow without doing lasting damage. Don't ask me how. You live alone long enough with enough late-night reading and medical curiosity, and you pick things up. He bucked, kicked, fought. But within seconds, his body went limp. I laid him in the grass like a broken toy. His mask had fallen off. Tony Stark, conquered. He looked like he was sleeping, mouth slightly open, snoring through half-shut lids. I should have felt guilt. Horror, maybe, but all I felt was a strange sense of calm. like I'd finally reclaimed something that had been stolen. When he stirred again, groggy and confused, I whispered, "Welcome to hell, kid." That's when he wet himself. His eyes welled up, face contorted, and he started sobbing, blubbering apologies between gasps like a toddler. I slapped him across the face, not out of rage, but to snap him out of it. He looked up at me like I was a demon. I told him he was lucky. Lucky I wasn't a killer. Lucky all I wanted was peace. But if he told anyone, if I so much as heard a whisper, I promised him his parents would pay piece by piece. And then I let him go. Just like that. No more words, no more contact. He ran, wet, shaking, broken into the night. And for a moment, everything was quiet again. As he stumbled away through the yard, shoes squelching with every step, I stood there, heart pounding, hands still tingling from where I'd slapped him. Tyson didn't look back. He didn't have to. He knew I meant every word. I hadn't just frightened him. I'd carved something into his memory, something he wouldn't ever forget. But I wasn't done yet. Just before he reached the fence, I called out to him, not yelling, just loud enough to slice through the silence. "One word," I said. "You breathe one word of this to anyone, and I'll find your house. I'll find your parents. And I won't knock first." I didn't scream. I didn't rage. I said it slow, cold, clinical. I told him that I didn't care if I went to jail. That honestly, prison sounded like a vacation, free meds, no mortgage, no trick-or-treaters. I told him I'd saw through his mom's neck with a hacksaw, that I'd start with her eyes just so she could watch what I did to his dad. And then I asked, "Do you understand me?" He nodded, barely able to hold himself upright. "That's our deal," I said. "You leave me alone. I leave your life intact." He vanished down the street, after that piss-darkened jeans sticking to his legs like wet cloth. I waited until I couldn't see him anymore, then finally turned and walked back inside, closing the door gently behind me. I didn't feel like a monster. I felt relieved, like I'd just taken control of something for the first time in years. That night, for the first time in a long time, I slept with the window open. I thought I'd ended it. But that's the thing about fear. It doesn't always follow orders. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it, that my little lesson stuck, and Tyson kept his mouth shut. But kids don't know how to carry secrets. Not real ones, especially not secrets soaked in fear. It didn't take long, maybe a week, before the first knock came. Not the playful rap of trick-or-treaters, but the measured, heavy knock of people who don't leave until you answer. Cops. 2 of them. One in uniform, the other in plain clothes with a notebook and a look that said he'd seen men like me before. I kept calm, offered them tap water, told them my version. Some kid tried to mess with my house and I scared him off. I might have grabbed him, pushed him off my lawn, but I didn't hit him, didn't choke him, didn't threaten him. They scribbled in silence, asked about the missing sign, the broken eggs. I told them I hadn't seen anything, just cleaned up the mess. They didn't arrest me, not yet. But they've been back. Once in the afternoon, once late at night, hoping to catch me off guard. And now, whenever I walk to the mailbox, I swear I can feel eyes on me from across the street, from behind half-closed blinds. The neighbors know something. Tyson talked. The little rat betrayed our deal. And now I have a decision to make. I could lie low. I could apologize, pretend I'm sick, unstable, or I could remind him what real fear looks like. And this time, I won't let him walk away. I know what you're thinking. You think I'm the bad guy. You think I went too far. But let me ask you this. What would you have done if it were your home, your peace, your sanity? Hanging by a thread, Tyson didn't just knock on my door. He kicked it in, metaphorically and literally. He trespassed, he taunted, he stole from me, vandalized my home, and then he cried when he got a taste of consequence. And now, because he couldn't keep his mouth shut, I've got cops circling my house like vultures, neighbors whispering behind curtains, and some paper-pushing judge probably ready to make an example out of me. You think I'm afraid of prison. I'm not. I've been living in one for years. Walls built from anxiety floors, laid with loneliness. A roof held up by meds and routine. Prison has structure, predictability. 3 meals a day, and nobody trick-or-treating at your door. So, yeah, maybe I crossed a line. But that line had already been blurred by a society that celebrates chaos once a year and punishes those who ask for peace. Tyson made a choice, and so did I. If they arrest me, fine. Let them. I'll get a cot, a roof, and more peace than I've had in a decade. Maybe I'll even get lucky and land a cell with a view. And who knows, maybe someday I'll write you again. A follow-up. From jail. Until then, don't knock on my door. You might not like who answers. So, that's it. That's the story no one wants to hear, but everyone needs to. Maybe you think I'm insane. Maybe you think I'm right. Either way, you'll remember my name. Not because I wanted attention, but because I demanded silence and got noise instead. So go ahead. Celebrate your little holiday. Knock on every door but mine. Just remember, not all monsters wear masks. Some of us answer the door. It was just before 10 p.m. on Halloween night, October 30th, 1993, in the sleepy coastal village of Brayford Hill, Northern Ireland. A quiet town tucked near the cliffs of the Derry coast, where Catholic families had lived for generations. The local bar, the Lantern Arms, a squat red brick building with fogged-up windows and crooked signage, was glowing that night with orange lights and laughter. Inside, townspeople in creepy costumes and papier-mâché masks filled the air with the rattle of pint glasses and the thrum of a tinny jukebox. Teenagers huddled in corners, sneaking their first sips of cider, while older locals gathered around the bar, swapping ghost stories and gossip. No one suspected that among them were 3 men in identical navy blue boiler suits and cheap Halloween balaclavas. When they entered the Lantern Arms, most thought it was part of the fun, just another trio trying to win the costume contest or prank the locals. Their masks revealed only slivers of skin around the eyes and mouth. But even then, there was something cold, something clinical about their presence. The bar's regulars had no idea that these men hadn't come for the drinks or the dancing. They weren't there to celebrate. They brought no party favors, no jokes, no mischief. What they carried with them, concealed in coats and tucked behind grins that weren't quite right, wasn't the spirit of Halloween. It was something older, something darker. What would unfold inside the Lantern Arms in the next 5 minutes would mark the bloodiest night Brayford Hill had ever known. A massacre disguised in costume, a slaughter veiled by the laughter of a holiday. Just 7 days before that fateful Halloween night, a different kind of horror unfolded nearly 80 miles away in the heart of Belfast. It was a gray Saturday afternoon, the kind of day where the clouds sit low and the city feels hushed, as if bracing itself. At 1:10 p.m., 2 men parked a faded blue Ford Escort just around the corner from O'Malley's Fish Market on Kensworth Lane. One of them, a wiry man with a stiff gait and nervous hands, hoisted a bulky gym bag from the trunk. He looked just like any courier making a delivery, but what he carried wasn't fish. It was a bomb. His name was Declan Rourke, a volunteer with the Belfast Brigade of the Irish Republican Army. Alongside him, stationed near the door as lookout, was Seamus Brennan, older steel-eyed a man who'd spent half his life in the undercurrents of sectarian warfare. Their mission to assassinate senior members of the Ulster Defence Association, or UDA, who, according to IRA intelligence, were meeting upstairs in the fishmonger's flat above the store. A single well-placed explosion, they believed, could decapitate the enemy's leadership. But everything went wrong. Unbeknownst to the IRA, the UDA had changed its plans last minute. The meeting had wrapped up hours earlier, the upper floor already vacated. Worse still, the bomb, constructed by a less than qualified local sympathizer, was unstable. The moment Rourke set the bag on the counter, it detonated. The explosion leveled the building. Declan was killed instantly, his body shredded in a flash of fire and glass. So were the owner Finian Doyle, his daughter Aoife, and a 12-year-old schoolgirl who'd only stopped in for a soda. 7 others died. Nearly 60 more were wounded. The IRA had hoped to strike a calculated blow. Instead, they delivered chaos. And in the devastated Protestant community of Belfast, that chaos was received not as a misfire, but as a message Catholics kill without care. It didn't matter that the IRA's intent was surgical. The result was carnage. And for men like Ned Hanley, commander of the UDA's Lisburn Brigade, that meant one thing: vengeance. The fuse had been lit, and on the other side of Northern Ireland, in a quiet town, no one thought to guard a trapdoor. To hell was slowly creaking open, its hinges oiled by rage loss and a twisted sense of justice. Brayford Hill had no idea what was coming. In the smoldering aftermath of the O'Malley's bombing, the streets of Belfast boiled with grief and fury. Makeshift memorials sprang up overnight, candles flickering in shop fronts, hand-painted signs reading, "They kill our children, we will not forget." The Protestant community, long hardened by decades of sectarian violence, was now seething with fresh rage. But none burned hotter than Ned Hanley, the steely-eyed commander of the Ulster Defence Association's Lisburn Brigade. Hanley was no stranger to bloodshed. He saw it as both tool and currency in the bitter trade of loyalty and fear. To him, the deaths at O'Malley's weren't just collateral. They were an affront, a slap in the face delivered by the Catholic enemy under the guise of politics. And though the IRA claimed the explosion was a tactical mistake, Hanley saw an opportunity dressed in tragedy. Within hours of the bombing, he convened a closed-door meeting in a rundown warehouse outside Lisburn. The walls still smelled of machine oil and dust, but Hanley's mind was sharp and focused. Around him stood a handful of trusted lieutenants, grizzled men who had spilled blood for the cause and would do it again. His message was simple. They struck us in the heart. We'll strike them where it hurts most, when they feel safe when they least expect it. He didn't want a political statement. He wanted fear. And so a plan began to take shape not in Belfast, which by now was teeming with security forces, but in the forgotten edges of the country, in places where suspicion traveled slower and vengeance could take root in silence. Hanley turned his gaze toward the coast. A small town, a Catholic stronghold, somewhere no one would ever see it coming. That town was Brayford Hill. While families there carved pumpkins and strung paper ghosts from their porches, the wheels of retaliation began to spin, oiled by grief, guided by hate, and soon to be carried out by 3 loyal soldiers with empty hearts and loaded guns. While Brayford Hill prepared for its annual Halloween festivities, kids picking out plastic masks, neighbors hanging orange lights, Ned Hanley's plan moved swiftly into motion. He summoned 3 men: Craig Fahey, a cold-blooded foot soldier with a penchant for control; Brandon Sykes, younger and eager to prove himself; and Gareth Rowan, a quiet enforcer who never questioned orders. These weren't drunks with grudges. They were professionals, killers. Their target was chosen not for its strategic value, but for its symbolism. The Lantern Arms wasn't just a bar. It was a gathering place for Catholics, a warm little hub where families celebrated births, mourned losses, and danced on holidays. Destroying it would do more than spill blood. It would rattle the soul of the town. On October 27th, just 3 days before the attack, the trio made their first move. Driving a nondescript Vauxhall sedan, they arrived in Brayford Hill under the cover of darkness, posing as travelers passing through. They ordered pints inside the Lantern Arms, chatted with locals, and walked the perimeter afterward, noting every entrance, every choke point, every blind spot. They weren't there for the Guinness. They were laying the blueprint for terror. That night, back at a rented farmhouse on the edge of the countryside, they pored over rough sketches of the bar's layout by candlelight, plotting where each man would stand, what weapons they would carry, and how long it would take to fire retreat and vanish. To the people of Brayford Hill, Halloween was about costumes and candy. To Hanley's men, it was the perfect mask. The stage was set. The weapons were loaded. And with each tick of the clock, the little town edged closer to a horror it couldn't imagine and would never forget. October 30th, 1993, a cool Atlantic wind swept through Brayford Hill, rustling the leaves and setting porch decorations gently swinging. Halloween had arrived in full force. Kids darted through the streets with plastic buckets and glow sticks, while adults gathered inside the lantern arms for the town's costume party, a long-standing tradition where the Guinness flowed and worries were left at the door. Inside, the pub pulsed with laughter folk tunes and the smell of sweat and cigarette smoke. Someone had dressed as Dracula, another as Margaret Thatcher. No one noticed the three men in matching navy blue boiler suits and black balaclavas. They looked like they belonged until they didn't. At exactly 9:58 p.m., the front door creaked open, and Craig Fahey, Brandon Sykes, and Gareth Rowan stepped inside. Fahey carried a Wisdom 58 assault rifle check-made fully automatic. Sykes held a 9mm Browning pistol. Rowan gripped a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun, the kind used for crowd control. For a brief moment, some partygoers chuckled, thinking the trio was pulling a prank. One woman clapped her hands and shouted, "That's the creepiest costume I've seen tonight." But then Fahey smiled, tight-lipped, joyless, and raised his rifle. "Trick or treat," he growled. The room froze. Then came the gunfire. Fahey unleashed a storm of bullets, 7.62mm rounds, tearing through wood glass and flesh. People screamed and ducked. A man in a werewolf mask crumpled by the jukebox. A young couple tried to flee, only for Sykes to shoot the girl in the back. His pistol jammed after that first shot. He frantically tried to clear it, hands trembling. Rowan stood at the entrance, his shotgun ready but unused. His job was to block the door, not to think. In under 10 seconds, Fahey had emptied his magazine, 30 rounds fired in controlled bursts. The silence that followed was shattered by sobs, gasps, and the moans of the wounded. A woman knelt beside her friend, whispering, "It's okay. Help's coming." But Fahey wasn't finished. He swapped in a fresh magazine. One woman, bloodied but alive, crawled toward him. "Please," she cried. "Please don't." Fahey didn't answer. He raised the rifle and shot her in the head. Another burst of gunfire erupted. Chairs, splintered bottles exploded, and bodies thudded to the ground. Some tried to shield others. A bartender threw himself over an elderly patron. It didn't matter. Fahey kept firing until his second magazine clicked dry. And then he laughed. Not loud, not maniacal. Just quiet, satisfied laughter, like a man admiring a job well done. The three men exited, calmly climbed into their stolen Vauxhall, and disappeared into the dark. By the time the first ambulance arrived, the Lantern Arms looked like a war zone. Blood pooled beneath tables. Shattered glass glittered like frost across the dance floor. 8 were dead, 19 more clung to life. The townspeople of Brayford Hill had dressed for ghosts and ghouls. They got something far worse. And the mask of Halloween, meant for mischief, had become the perfect veil for a massacre. The morning after the massacre, Brayford Hill woke to a silence that wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the weight of something shattered. Families stood outside the Lantern Arms, clinging to one another, as body bags were loaded into ambulances. The local priest, Father Callahan, held a blood-stained rosary in his hand, muttering prayers for the dead. News vans arrived by noon, but even they struggled to capture the raw horror of what had happened. That same day, a statement from the Ulster Defense Association surfaced. In it, the group coldly referred to the attack as a raid, framing it as justified retaliation for the bombing at O'Malley's fish market. The nationalist electorate will pay a heavy price. The UDA warned, claiming they had intelligence that senior IRA figures drank at the Lantern Arms. But that was a lie. No militants were present that night. only townsfolk in masks, laughing, drinking, living. Behind closed doors, however, there was celebration. UDA leadership praised the gunmen, calling them patriots. Craig Fahey reportedly bragged about the woman he executed as she begged for her life. The public statements were wrapped in political language. The private truths were soaked in blood. And for Brayford Hill, no justification could make sense of what they had lost. Despite the UDA's carefully worded justifications, justice came knocking eventually. British intelligence services, long embedded within both Protestant and Catholic paramilitary groups, had no trouble tracing the bragging. Craig Fahey, Brandon Sykes, and Gareth Rowan hadn't been subtle. Their names spread through pubs and whispers trickling into the hands of informants like blood through gauze. By mid-November, all three men were arrested and charged with 8 counts of murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. The trial that followed was swift but haunting. Survivors filled the courtroom, some with bandages still visible, others clutching framed photos of loved ones lost. Fahey showed no remorse. He sat with a crooked smile, occasionally glancing back at the grieving families. Sykes remained largely silent. Rowan notably laughed during the proceedings, mocking victims' relatives, even calling one man a coward as he was led out in handcuffs. In February of 1995, all three were sentenced to life imprisonment. It was a moment that felt briefly like closure. The people of Brayford Hill hoped it marked the end of a nightmare that the law at last had spoken. But justice, as history so often reminds us, is not always final. In the shadow of peace, negotiations, a darker compromise was waiting, one that would make many wonder whether accountability was ever truly part of the plan. 5 years after the massacre at the Lantern Arms, the ink dried on a document that promised peace, the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. It was hailed as a landmark achievement, a bridge across decades of bloodshed in Northern Ireland. But for many in Brayford Hill, it also felt like a betrayal. Hidden within the clauses of reconciliation was a controversial provision, the early release of paramilitary prisoners. In the year 2000, Craig Fahey, Brandon Sykes, and Gareth Rowan walked out of prison. They had served less than 6 years of their so-called life sentences. The same men who had opened fire on a Halloween party, who had laughed in court, who had extinguished 8 lives in seconds, were now free men, released not because they were reformed, but because the paperwork said so. The town was stunned. Survivors wept. Some left Brayford Hill for good, unable to bear the thought of sharing a country, let alone a future with the men who had shattered their peace. Government officials called it a necessary step toward healing. But for those who had sat in the blood-stained bar or buried friends beneath cold soil, it felt like justice had been traded for headlines. Peace had come, but at a price measured not in diplomacy, but in ghosts. If this story moved you, disturbed you, or made you see the world just a little differently, we invite you to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next journey into the hidden, the haunting, and the human. Every click, every share helps us bring forgotten voices back into the light and remind the world that some stories aren't meant to fade. Thank you for watching and for standing with us as we uncover the truth, one chilling tale at a time.